Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our special show Perspective, where we bring you 360-degree holistic view of all key issues, be it national or international. Today we're going to talk about Indian economy and specifically the core sectors where there has been good growth. In fact, the output from India's 8 core sectors has accelerated for the second consecutive month in August, rising to 11.6% compared to a 6.9% contraction recorded a year ago. Although crude oil and fertilizer output declined, 4 out of 8 core sectors have registered strong double-digit growth according to the index of 8 core industries released by DPIIT. Now, the ICI measures combined and individual performances of production in selected 8 core industries, which include coal, crude oil, natural gas, refinery products, fertilizers, steel, cement, and electricity. These 8 core industries comprise 40.27% of the weight of items included in the IIP, that is Index of Industrial Production. Now, the August output of ICI was 3.9% higher than the pre-COVID levels compared to July, which recorded a 1.1% uptick over the 2019 levels. Now, cement production jumped 36% as compared to 14.5% contraction in August last year, while coal and natural gas registered a 20.6% surge. Electricity and refinery products grew by 15.3% and 9.1% respectively, and steel output grew by 5.1%. Now, core sectors output had grown 9.9% in July and 9.3% in June. In fact, the growth rate of index of 8 core industries for May has been revised to 16.4% from its earlier provisional level of 16.8%. In this episode, we will discuss and analyze the reasons behind this growth and its impact on overall economic recovery. And for more on this, we're joined by 3 distinguished experts. Let me start introducing them to you. Beginning with, we have with us Shubhmoy Bhattacharjee. He is consulting editor with the Business Standard. We're also joined by Mr. Ajay Dua, is former secretary with the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India. And Professor Charan Singh is also joining us. He is the CEO of eGrow Foundation. Welcome, all of you gentlemen. Let me begin with you, Shubhmoy, since you've been writing regularly about this, covering this aspect in detail. What do we make of these figures, specifically when we're talking about 8 core sectors and that too, double-digit growth in 4 of them?
Well, you know, what we would look at now, the data is, first of all, for the Indian economy, after the last year's lockdown, the 3 months lockdown, April, May, June, and this year's again almost a similar period, made the data quite uncomparable. It was very difficult to do comparisons. Now we are entering a segment where the data is sort of comparable. Okay. So with last year's, and then if we look at it, what's happening in, say, February 2020, then you start getting a sense of what's happening. Well, otherwise what happens is when there was a slump of the sort that we saw, a 23.6% drop, on that any jump would have looked astronomical, which it did. Now going on, when August, September data is coming along, we are seeing a much more clearer, realistic assessment of what's happening in the economy. Okay. And looking at that, the figures are actually starting to look very nice. You talked of the core sector data, but just at the beginning, I would like to offer another data, which is the Purchasing Managers Index, and which has come out today. And that is showing a growth rate of 53.6. Remember, in August, it was something like 52 point something. So what it is showing, that these are sequential, remember. It measures month on month. So this is not being affected by what has happened, say, in April, May. It's affected by what's happened in August. So the September data is showing that there is really a rise in the manufacturing strength in the economy. Okay. You wouldn't want to look at this in terms of figures which have got distorted. So while the core sector data, some of those data, and we'll come to that later in the discussion, is also looking very impressive. I'm also heartened by the fact that the PMI is looking better. Okay. In fact, this was a rise which, if it hadn't sort of started showing, then we would have said that, hang on, we need to be careful for a bit more time. Right now, it does, I mean, with the core sector data, which will be showing in the IIP, this data is actually showing an interesting move upwards.
Okay, so the PMI data also shows the complementary levels of growth when we are looking at the core sector data, the growth figures out there. Let me bring in Mr. Ajay Dua here. Mr. Dua, from your perspective, if we have to understand, would it be safer to say that now the road to recovery has steadied a little bit and we are now moving on a plane where, if you look at all the figures, including the PMI data also, the path seems to be pretty clear from here onwards?
Shal, thank you for including me in the discussion here today. I share the optimism which you expressed and which was mentioned by Subhamay as well. I think after what we saw in Q1, Q2, starting in June, or say July, has been rather good. One, the rates have been favorable. When I say favorable, that there was a lull in the month of August after the rain started in July, and that gave opportunity for the production which normally sags during the heavy monsoon didn't happen this year. As a result, the movement of men and cargo, both finished raw materials and finished goods, didn't get affected. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed because the heavy rain actually fell during September. We saw some accident levels, and I hope that does not sag the data for September. Second, the pent-up demand, which was in the economy, because for 3 months or 4 months, people could not effect purchases from March to say July till June for sure, when we had a COVID wave 2. That helped in kind of boosting the aggregate demand, as a result of which the supplies became robust. And I'm hoping that this kind of optimism remains going forward. As you mentioned, the core sector, the 8 industries, important as they are, they do not cover 60% of the index of industrial production, in which 80% is manufacturing, 10% each roughly is mining and electricity. The electricity gets included in this already, so it is a question of at least half of it which doesn't quite, or say 60% really, which doesn't quite cover. But the figures which we have today of June of IIP, they also showed that there was a recovery. So I'm hoping that what we are seeing in the figures of core sector growth would also get, as and when the figures for the July and August become available for IIP. The IIP index, I'm optimistic and hoping for the best.
Professor Singh, I'd like to bring you in here and, taking it forward from where Mr. Dua left, in terms of the consistency, if you're looking at, and if you look at the data of last 2 to 3 months, then it looks like that there is a consistency in the growth pattern out there, specifically when we're talking about these 8 core sectors.
You're very right, and both the speakers before me have nailed it in the head. There is no doubt about it. If you look at the green shoots are very, very clear. It's a long time since I've been saying one thing. The economy is robust, the economy is strong, the fundamentals are there. All that had happened is, because of COVID, there's little slowdown in certain sectors, there was a lockdown in certain other sectors. There was no lockdown in banking, insurance, there was no lockdown in defense, police. So something was going on. Essential commodities, milk, those were being supplied. Even during lockdown, vegetables and other food material was available. So something was working already. In addition, the worry was, here is labor, here is capital. Banks were ready with all the resources if there were people who were ready to invest or required their money. The government was providing all the support that was required, coming out again and again. And here, and I should mention, the finance minister was very proactive You make a suggestion, the industry house has made suggestion, and she would immediately react to it and do corrective measures.
Okay.
So on industry, on MSMEs, constantly support was being provided. And the results are for everyone to see.
Indeed.
The tax authorities accommodated, the banking sector accommodated, the government accommodated, and that is what exactly is reflected in the data. The 8 core industries which you are referring are actually the backbone of the industrial sector.
Indeed, indeed. It's all.
If these are robust, it is obvious that the rest of the sectors will also be very robust.
Indeed, everything is correlated, interrelated when we're talking about the overall economic growth or overall the economic recovery issue. And I'll take one or two points from what Professor Singh and Mr. Dua also mentioned. When we're talking about these green shoots and when we're looking at this data, either the core sector data or the PMI one which you referred to, pent-up demand, obviously one aspect, fundamentals of the economy being strong, the other aspect, and quite a lot of effort being put by both the policymakers as well as the industry also.
That's right. I'll like to clarify one point here. It's interesting that we are talking about core sector data. Core sector data does not reflect pent-up demand.
Okay.
Core sector movement is a factor of longer-term movement in the economy. When you look at, say, IIP, of course, there you have consumer non-durables. You could relate that to pent-up demand. Core sector movement, because these are the sectors like fertilizers, electricity, petroleum, natural gas, cement, steel. Industry does not change its demand month on month. It reflects a longer term phenomena. So I would agree with Professor Chan Singh that essentially they would have been seeing that the fundamentals of the economy are stronger.
Okay.
And because of that, they would have been building up their order books. You see, you don't get a steel rise. I mean, industrialist doesn't just turn around and say 15 days later, hey, change, I want a fresh supply of steel ingots coming in. Similarly, the only one where you could have a sort of pent-up demand effect is electricity. Because electricity responds to, there's a lot of domestic power demand and all the things sort of thing. And in India, that's considerably, that's become quite big.
Indeed.
So those are the sort of stuff. But others do not. Fertilizers, for instance. The reason why fertilizer has gone down, you mentioned it earlier. Now, why has it gone down? It's because monsoon is not the time when you apply fertilizers. You apply it in other seasons. Typically, every year, if you deseasonalize the fertilizer numbers, you'll see monsoons are not the time when it rises.
What about crude oil then?
Exactly. Now, the fact that it's rising, these are processing figures. And that just shows that the companies are building up for the demand surge that they expect in the months going ahead, which is why you see the numbers are gradually moving up. It's not surprise, for instance, across the world, that natural gas prices are already rising.
Okay.
It's not that the demand has risen now. They will be rising in winter across the world. And that is why natural gas prices are reacting now. So core sector, essentially, weakness in core sector as well as strength in core sector reflects a longer term movement in the industry in the country.
Okay.
Which is why I'm quite impressed, and which is why the commentators are also pointing about that the core sector movement and the fact that it's come out fairly substantially on, remember, this is both sequentially as well as on year, when it's been deseasonalized to a certain extent because of the moving out of COVID. It's showing strength.
Okay, definitely. And that's a longer curve there, which you're talking about in terms of the way the core sector will behave or will react to what's actually happening on the ground. Mr. Dua, if we have to look at the long-term situation here, and it has been just almost around 3 to 4 months since we have been through the second wave of COVID. So obviously, those post-pandemic scenario, when we're talking about, these are first few figures coming in, which give us a sense that, yes, we are on the right path. But if you have to look at the longer run, how do you see things moving from here onwards, one? And two, what needs to be done?
Vishal, let me just, before I reply to these two important questions, let me just clarify about what Sumubai said. Unless there is a demand from the consumers for automobiles, engineering goods, electrical goods, which is a consumer pent-up demand, it would not reflect after a month in the demand for the so-called the producer goods. That's the producer goods, meaning steel or the mother industry products. We need to be concerned about the commodity prices, international commodity prices. They impact economic activity in particularly the countries which are import dependent the way we are.
Okay.
For 80% of our the crude oil, natural gas 60% and basically importers of energy. We are importers of lot of minerals, copper, etc., which are seeing their prices go through the roof. Now, as you know, Brent for us itself is now $80. The crude oil, yesterday's prices, and we see the inflation. So I'm a little concerned about that, one. Second, I'm also concerned that going forward, we need to see private sector. It cannot be private sector investment reviving. It is still tardy. Now that the private sector has been concerned about aggregate demand being less. So how do we handle that? One is government stimulus. Government has done what it could or what its wallet can allow. I think going forward, if the wage component, if the economy increases, that means employment wage rates increase. That is the best way forward to make sure that there is more effective demand in the economy. That will spur the private sector, which is today at about 60 to 65% utilization of capacity, to go forward and take measures to make investment.
Okay.
Money is there, liquidity is there, and finally I said that you have to be concentrating on making that the more even distribution of the recovery process. That means benefit goes to people who spend more, not who save more.
Okay.
And it is at the bottom end of the economy that our consumption level is higher than at the middle, or certainly not at the top level, where it all goes into savings, not even being invested. So it doesn't bring about the benefits which are expected.
Okay, that's quite a lot of suggestions coming in from you there, Mr. Dua. Let me bring in Professor Singh here as well. Professor Singh, would you agree with these 2-3 aspects which Mr. Dua has brought out when we're talking about what needs to be done both in the short term and in the long term specifically, and you know, these aspects of dealing with the issues of employment, wages, and ensuring that there is an even distribution of the recovery process, as Mr. Dua put it?
These are challenges. This will not happen in near future. This cannot happen in near future. When you are under dire circumstances, when survival is at stake, these are very good points, but these will not happen immediately according to my understanding and analysis. But the thrust of the argument which Mr. Dua is making is in the right direction, and that is the way to go forward. Now let me take some of these into account. What has happened in the Western world when you take employment? Most of the employment in public sector and government has stayed as it is in India, as well as in the Western world. But the private sector, which is financially constrained, had lots of challenges. There have been lots of high attrition rate. So what has the private sector done in foreign countries? Instead of a permanent job, they have gone for a large number of temporary jobs.
Okay.
So that is right. We have to somehow maintain, because that's where the demand will come in. And that's how you sustain demand. When it comes to wages, in the public sector, in the government, there has been no compromise on wages. But in the private sector, we all know that the wages had to be compromised to the extent of 70 to 75%.
Okay.
But still, the private sector played a very important role and did not lay off people. It addressed what the Prime Minister requested them in the beginning: be humane, don't let people go, and we will provide you all types of support. And the government did provide support in terms of Provident Fund contributions and all that.
Indeed.
Now, when you say the wages have to improve, I would like to say 2 things here. One is, when people tell me that there is shortage of demand, I always ask a simple question. Please tell me why two-wheelers are selling, why tractors are selling. Tractors, of course, agriculture is doing very well. Why cars are selling. I was reading recently a report. Lamborghini has sold largest number of cars in India in the last 2 years, what they had not sold even in the last, before that, 10 years. So that means, and they said, out of the 2 years, 18 months are COVID time, and still they sold those cars. So the point I'm making is, there is purchasing power. The stock market is a daily demonstration of purchasing power. Sale of scooters is daily demonstration. I was asking people in the housing sector, what is the level of correction? Have you seen house correction take place to 30%, 20%, 15%? No. So the point I'm making is there is purchasing power. So wage correction for the private sector may not be easy at this point of time. The last point I want to make in this context is, if India wants to be a $5 trillion or a $10 trillion economy, who's going to do it? The government cannot increase more jobs. They have done as much as they can. Of course, there is scope. I don't deny that. If you look at the public sector jobs in India vis-a-vis the rest of the world, there is lots of scope in India. It can expand. But the taxes don't increase. Where will these people get their salaries from? So the private sector has to play a pivotal role in this recovery. And the trade associations that are there, they have also to play a pivotal role in this recovery. So I would like to conclude by saying, Mr. Dua's points are well taken according to my understanding, but they'll need some amount of threshold level of growth before they start getting implemented. Equitable distribution of growth, which people are talking, you can't do equitable distribution of growth at this stage until there is a threshold level.
Well, that's very aptly put up by Professor Singh there. Shubhmoy, I'd like to take concluding comment from you in terms of what needs to be done from here onwards. Quite a lot of challenges, but the thrust of the argument which is coming in, and the underlying theme of what I can understand here is that both the government and the industry, by industry the private sector, will have to work hand in hand. Policy tweaks will have to keep on happening depending on the situation, but the private sector will also have to keep on putting its best foot forward.
Absolutely. And I mean, I quite take on board what Mr. Dua is saying. I mean, you can't argue with the fact that we need more support for the lowest income group, especially after what COVID has done. But you know what? The Indian economy still now is less than what it was in 2019-20, despite all the growth. So growth is obviously the most important thing. But with that growth, the biggest challenge this winter is going to be the inflation challenge. Commodity prices across the world are rising. It's rising in India. And this will be the biggest challenge for RBI, for the government, because inflation hits the poorest the most.
Indeed.
So that would mean that a certain amount of liquidity suction will have to be happening, which would mean that many of the private sector companies would be saying, hang on, but my cost of production is rising, just as I was thinking of making investments. So it is actually a bit ticklish challenge. Does RBI pull back the punch bowl before the growth is really sustained or not? And that, I think, is the biggest short-term challenge from now till March next year.
And we'll have to wait and watch as to what exactly the RBI and specifically the government's stand on that would be. We'll come back on that aspect also. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, Mr. Dua, Professor Charan Singh, as well as Shubhmoy for sharing your views and insights. There it is, all about the growth in the core sectors of Indian economy. Quite a positive cue there. We've understood the reasons behind that. And of course, as our panelists were pointing out, there are a lot of challenges ahead when we're talking about the overall economic recovery, and there are ways to tackle those challenges also. We'll keep a close watch on all the developments and bring you a detailed and informative discussion on all related aspects. Keep watching Perspective on Sansad TV. Thank you.